wormholes are a bit like leaky pipes. Not everything is fitting together. The singularity is not a place inside the black hole, it's a place in the future. I think it's common, maybe not to feel good, to feel that maybe you're not good enough, but well, eventually you'll make your contributions.
Professor Juan Maldacena has spent 30 years probing deeper and deeper into what the heck space-time is. In this episode, we explore how it comes down to the claim that geometry, in some cases, is what entanglement looks like from the inside. Today, we discuss what ER equals EPR actually means, and we discuss black hole interiors, where
Singularity is just the name for things we don't understand.
Most of us intuitively assume there's a sort of view from nowhere, that you can just do quantum mechanics from the outside, look in, and write down what's there. Professor Juan Maldacena discusses why we can't. On this channel, I interview researchers regarding their theories of reality with rigor and technical depth. My name's Curt Jaimungal. I've included further resources on my Substack at curtjaimungal.com if you're interested. Stick toward the end for advice for students, for you, the listener, as we see a strikingly honest, vulnerable, and inspiring perspective from the man who wrote the most cited paper in theoretical physics. During his graduate studies, even Juan Maldacena didn't feel good enough. If you're struggling with something similar, hang in there. Keep studying, keep pushing forward, and don't give up. Professor, it's an honor to meet you.
Well, it's great to be with you.
What is space-time made out of?
Well, space-time in the theory of general relativity is not made out of anything. It's a primary concept. It's the main dynamical object of the theory. The question about what it is made of is only relevant for a more fundamental theory, some other theory. And we think by thinking about the quantum mechanics of space-time that it can be at least convenient sometimes to think of it as made of something else. And the something else could be qubits or some other fundamental quantum degrees of freedom that live in the boundaries of this space-time, that live far away. Yeah, that's a relationship that we've been studying quite a bit in the last maybe 20 years or more. Yeah, so it's a picture where space-time is emergent from some other degrees of freedom that live on the boundary space-time. So in that picture, there is this boundary, this region far away that serves as a framework, as some overall space or space-time where the degrees of freedom that describe the interior of the space-time live. So in that description, we are listing that boundary.
You said it could be quantum degrees of freedom.
Yes.
What else could it be?
Well, it could be other things. I mean, in physics, when we say something is made out of something else, right? We think about some more fundamental things. And in different examples, they're made of different things. In general, in all of physics, in most of physics, it's made out of particles, we say. I mean, that's what, let's say, we learn in high school and so on, that matter is made out of particles. In modern physics, we describe things not as made out of particles, but made out of fields, like the electromagnetic field, the electron field, the Higgs field, various fields. And that, we think, is the basic fabric of reality, of nature at short distances. That's the theory we really have experimental confirmation from. So then all those fields live in some space-time. The space-time is given, is some kind of fixed arena where everything happens. But in general relativity, space-time itself moves and changes, and we think that in some sense it's described by some other field, and whereas the fields of matter, we describe them quantum mechanically. The field that makes the metric or the space-time geometry, we describe only classically. We only know how to describe it classically, and if we try to we can describe it quantum mechanically in an approximate way, and that approximate theory can give us some answers, but it cannot give us all answers. Somehow, we know it fails in some cases. The most important place where it fails, it's in the beginning of the universe, and this is the main reason we want to find a better theory, to find out what happened in the beginning of the universe. Another place where it fails is in the interior of black holes, and that's another reason for trying to understand the better theory. So we know of places in the universe where our current understanding of physics breaks, and the idea is to develop at least some theory that can describe such things, and then try to figure out, of course, in some way that theory is the correct theory. We don't know whether the theories we have right now of quantum spacetime, more complete theories, where they are the correct theory or not.
And what would you say is the primary reason for the difficulty of combining GR with quantum theory? So the pop sci is that, oh, one is discrete and one is continuous, or one is linear, one is nonlinear. How do you see the incompatibility between the two?
Well, I think the main issue is that in quantum mechanics, there is usually some time, some order between operators, and in order between in the measurements we make. In general relativity and in gravity, space-time can have different geometries, different topologies. We don't know what the order is. Also, another conceptual difficulty is that in quantum mechanics, we have some observer who's outside the system, and in gravity, everything is somehow inside the system. So we cannot have an observer that has no mass, that has no energy, that measures things from outside. Whatever observer exists inside the universe has its own energy, and yes, these are some of the features that make it difficult. I mean, there are some other technical things people often discussed that are special to, let's say, 4 space-time dimensions, which is that there are certain infinities that appear in the calculations, but that I would say it's a more technical issue rather than a more conceptual issues like the ones we mentioned earlier.
Now, what's the difference between a conceptual issue and then a mathematical one?
Well, I would say a mathematical one is one where the issue is not there, let's say, in 2 dimensions, but it's there maybe in 4 dimensions. So from this point of view, it looks like an accident that we live in 4 dimensions. I mean, yeah, if we happen to live in 2 dimensions, we would still have a bunch of conceptual issues related to quantum gravity, but we would not have perhaps that technical issue which I just mentioned, or that technical issue will be a little easier. But the other questions are still there. In 2 dimensions, we still have black holes that are confusing. In finite universes, we have the issue of having to include the observer and exactly how we should do that. Yeah, so those are issues that still remain.
Earlier, you mentioned observers. Now, Witten, along with Pennington and some other collaborators, helped fix what happens inside a black hole interior with type 3 to type 2 algebras and some technicalities. Is that observer that's talked about in those papers the same sort of observer that's talked about in, say, the foundations of quantum mechanics?
Yeah, it's related. I mean, their description is perturbative, so starting with a particular background and considering small fluctuations around that background. It's in the context of what we sometimes called semi-classical gravity. So I mentioned previously that quantum gravity makes sense in a certain approximation, and that's the approximation in which they did their discussion. And so it's an extension of those methods to deal with situations where maybe we have a closed universe, so a spatially compact universe, or a region of the universe where the observer can access only to a portion of the universe, such as the Sitter space. And let's say it's an improvement relative to what we had before. So that's what it does. It does not answer the questions of what happened in the beginning of the Big Bang, or how the observer actually emerged in the very beginning, and so on. So that it does not do. But this is normal in physics, right? So we do some things, we understand some aspects, and make progress, and there are still important questions.
Was it a surprising result to you?
Yeah, I think it was a beautiful way of improving our understanding of the so-called generalized entropy. So let me say a little bit more what that is. So if you have a black hole, the black hole has an entropy in the leading approximation, which is the area of the horizon in Planck units. This is a very large number for a macroscopic black hole, but this entropy was then supposed to have a quantum correction that comes from Hawking radiation. So Hawking radiation is some radiation that is, pretty well, it's some thermal radiation that comes out of the black hole. And if you are looking at this radiation and you are looking at it from the point of view of an observer who stays outside the black hole, and you approach the boundary of the horizon, so the boundary of the region that is accessible, then it looks like it's hotter and hotter and hotter. And naively computed, the contribution to the entropy coming from that would be infinite. However, we think that infinite contribution somehow combines with this area contribution, which is very large and gives really something that should be viewed as finite. And what these papers did is they understood how to combine, how to derive an expression for the entropy that would be finite or would describe changes in this entropy in a consistent way without ever having to talk about any infinity or cancellations of infinities. So it's a better way to think about black hole entropy in the semi-classical theory. It answers some questions of black hole entropy. Again, it doesn't answer all the questions, but it answers some important questions. It answers the questions that are related to, let's say, the interaction of a black hole with some amount of matter, an amount of matter which is not big enough to change the mass of the black hole in an appreciable way, but it describes that matter in a completely quantum mechanical way, and the entropy of that matter in a completely quantum mechanical way without any infinities or anything.
Right.
Now, these infinities are some technical issue which this paper solved and made the theory more reasonable.
You said it solves some problems of black holes, some important problems. That means that there are some other important problems that may be left unsolved. So what are the greatest unsolved problems about black holes?
I would say the greatest problem is understanding better the black hole interiors. And the black hole interior, the space-time curvature becomes infinite. That infinite means that something happens that we don't know how to describe. So if you don't know what this means, we don't know either. We don't know what happens at the so-called singularity. So singularity is just the name for things we don't understand. But so the Einstein equations themselves predict that as you evolve them towards the interior, you hit this singularity. The singularity is not a place sort of inside the black hole, it's a place in the future. You go to the interior of the black hole and you find this singularity in your future, so you can't avoid it. It's a bit like a big crunch singularity, somewhat similar. So a singularity where that whole region of the universe collapses. I mean, one way to think about it is that the universe is generally expanding, right? And so we're all happy when the universe expands, but in some regions where a lot of matter gets concentrated, the universe starts collapsing. And in these regions, you produce a small big crunch. So a region where the space-time curvature becomes infinite, the opposite of a Big Bang. And that is not visible from the outside. It's behind the so-called black hole horizon. So we don't directly get any signal from this region. But if you were someone who's falling into the black hole, you would get into this region and you would collapse together with the rest of the matter making the black hole. Now, so the fact that the space-time curvature becomes very large suggests that in these regions, the quantum effects will become important. And so if a full theory should say exactly what happens there and should give us a more complete description. And we don't yet have such a thing. What we do have are some theories that can describe aspects of black holes as seen from the outside. So if you remain outside the black hole and ask what we think are very precise questions about the black hole, then we have we think we know what would happen, at least conceptually. Part of what we were discussing previously about the entropy and the algebras and the work of Pennington is related to describing the black hole from the outside.
I have a question about Elusio and Turiace, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Either way, I'll place a link on screen and in the description. If I recall correctly, they showed that semi-classical near extremal black holes, that their thermodynamics breaks down at the Schwarzschild scale. Now, does that break holography, or is that just specific to JT gravity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me try to describe this general area. So there are black holes and there are charged black holes. So black holes can carry charge. And if you have a large charged black hole, as it evaporates, the temperature becomes smaller and it emits energy, but it keeps its charge. And so there is some state that it approaches where it has the minimal mass consistent with that charge, and that's a non-zero mass. So its Hawking temperature goes to zero. That's so-called an extremal black hole. And the black hole develops a geometry that has a near horizon geometry with a very long near horizon region, if you wish. And it develops a kind of scaling symmetry, if you wish. It becomes self-similar in some way. So you can get closer and closer and closer to the horizon, and the black hole looks the same. Okay, so you can have one of these very big black holes, and if the black hole is very big, then you would expect that the quantum gravity corrections are very small, you might think. But if you go to very, very close to zero temperature or very, very close to extremality, then there is a very particular quantum correction that becomes important. And that's very interesting because it's an example of a controllable situation in quantum gravity where only one aspect of the geometry becomes quantum mechanical, but the remaining aspects of the geometry are still classical, and we don't have to worry about them. So it's a case where you can really quantize gravity. You can quantize, if you wish, a particular degree of freedom of gravity. In some sense, it is as if the black hole becomes very long, and this length can have fluctuations, quantum fluctuations, and you can treat them precisely. And this exact quantum treatment of the fluctuations is something that was really only understood. This aspect of extremal black holes was only understood in the last maybe decade or so. And it went through a sequence of developments, starting with some toy models based on condensed matter analogies and so on. So it's a pretty interesting story that I won't give you in detail. And this particular paper that you quoted by Iliescu and Turiachi, they analyzed this for four-dimensional black holes in general relativity that carry very big electric charge, and they showed that the entropy as you approach extremality becomes small. I should say that the important aspect is that these quantum corrections change some qualitative aspects of these black holes. In particular, these black holes seem to violate the third law of thermodynamics. So the third law of thermodynamics says that as you decrease the temperature of the system all the way to zero, its entropy should also go all the way to zero. Now, these black holes, if you just treat them purely classically, ignoring the quantum corrections, at extremality, they have zero temperature, but non-zero entropy. And once you include the quantum corrections, the entropy sort of decreases essentially all the way to zero. So this correction has the important feature of making these black holes also now consistent with the third law of thermodynamics, more similar to ordinary quantum systems. That's one aspect, and well, there are other aspects in this highly quantum regime that are also very interesting.
I subscribe to The Economist. Their science and their AI coverage is among the best I've found anywhere. And I say that as someone who reads plenty of it. I'll give you some examples. They just ran an analysis on how attitudes towards science are changing in American politics and what this means for research and funding in scientific institutions moving forward. This sort of high-quality reporting is fantastic. They even covered how dark energy may be weakening over time. Now, if that holds up, it completely changes our understanding of the universe's fate. If you watch this channel, those are exactly the kinds of questions that we explore every week. I subscribe to The Economist because their science and their AI reporting regularly surprises me with how deep it goes. And they're also, of course, known for global affairs, both political and economic reporting. They are top tier, and interestingly and flatteringly, Toe is one of the only podcasts that The Economist partners with. So as a listener, you get an exclusive 35% off. That's not a deal that they have just anywhere. Head to economist.com/TOE to subscribe. That's economist.com/TOE for 35% off. Now, what about the island formula?
Yeah, so this is related to the black hole information paradox. So there is a problem that was pointed out originally by Hawking, that after he discovered Hawking radiation, he thought, well, a black hole can collapse in many different ways, but the radiation it emits seems to be a featureless thermal radiation that's largely independent of what fell in. And that does not seem to be consistent with the unitarity of quantum mechanics. I mean, the black hole might evaporate completely, and you get this featureless thermal radiation. And of course, something similar happens when you burn a piece of paper and so on. But in that particular case, if you work hard enough and so on, you would be able to recover the information, at least in principle. The laws of physics are understood to the extent that in principle should allow you to do it. I mean, it might be super expensive, not worth the trouble, and so on. But in principle,
it's like in detective shows when they try to take the shredded documents and put it together. It's a more complicated version of that.
Exactly. It's the same thing. I mean, when you shred a document, in principle, the information is there. If you're patient enough, you can put it back together. But yeah, if you throw the document into a black hole, can you do that? And the laws of physics. And so we think that the laws of physics are such that they would allow you to do that. And that is true in some, according to some conjectures that use string theory and so on. Now, the question was how to see that more directly from the gravity point of view. So what Hawking said is, well, I can calculate something called the amount of quantum information that you get in the radiation. This is sometimes called the von Neumann entropy. It's a measure of quantum information. And if you calculate it, it looks like it is increasing. So you send something in and then you get something bigger. And it was a mystery of how you would see this from the gravity point of view. So the island formula, well, it came after developments by Amhary, Engelhardt, Maroff, and Maxfield, and a separate paper by Pennington. So this formula is a way to compute the entropy of the outgoing radiation. So there is a way to compute the entropy of the outgoing radiation, which is similar to the entropy of the black hole that we saw before, the area formula. So it's a new type of area formula that allows us to compute the entropy of the radiation. And it gives us an entropy which is consistent with the idea that you are preserving information. So as the black hole evaporates, and when it's close to evaporating completely, then the entropy it becomes smaller. So in the sense that all the and that is interpreted as saying that all the information is coming out. So it makes it's something that closes a bit the development of black hole entropy from the 70s. So in the 70s, there were people noticed that black holes, as seen from the outside, they behave very much like thermodynamic systems. They have a temperature, they have a Hawking radiation. All of these are theoretical discoveries. They are not things you can that have been checked in experiments. We can discuss experiments later. And the area of the black hole also classically always increases, and Aaron Wall also showed that if you even if you include quantum corrections, the area of black holes increases. The area of black holes, together with the radiation that is outside, the total entropy increases. So that's the so-called second law. So the second law of thermodynamics applied to black holes. And what happened starting around 2006 or so was that a new formula was discovered for black hole entropy. It was discovered by Ryu and Takayanagi, two Japanese physicists, one of them working here in the US. And they found a new formula that calculates a slightly different type of entropy. So in thermodynamics, there are two types of entropy. One is the one that appears in the second law. It's sometimes called the Boltzmann entropy. But then there is a second kind of entropy which measures the amount of fine-grained information, so quantum information. It measures the amount of information that you have about the system if you are able to measure things precisely as much as you can. So if you had infinite resources, so let's go back to your example of shredding a piece of paper. So if you shred a piece of paper, you naively lose the information that is in the piece of paper. But it's someone, with a lot of resources and the resources of the FBI, etc. It can in principle recover the information, right? So for someone with enough resources, the information is not lost, right? But there are ways of scrambling something enough so that the information is lost. If you really take that information away and store it somewhere else, you take out all the little letters and you just leave the shredded paper and you took out all the letters. And
yes.
You make sure that the information is not there. And so this other new form of entropy, this form of entropy, it's a standard form of entropy that people use to describe quantum systems, measures that second kind of information, the information available to someone who has infinite resources. And that's what this new formula gives us. It gives us gives us the formula for the entropy in terms of an area. It's not the area of the horizon, it's the area of some other surface that depends on the geometry of the interior. So you are supposed to look at the interior of the black hole and find the area, the surface with some extremal area. So the area which, let's say it's a minimum, just informally speaking. So some region where the area is a minimum, and that minimum value of the area is that entropy. So it's a formula that is surprisingly simple, very similar to the formulas of black hole entropy, and it represents an extension of those ideas of black hole thermodynamics and it represents a connection between space-time geometry and quantum information, because this notion of entropy, I should say this notion of entropy is intimately connected with the Shannon entropy, the notion of classical information.
Uh-huh.
Actually, as a side comment, Shannon entropy was invented after von Neumann entropy. And after this quantum version of the entropy that we're discussing right now. Anyway, so these concepts of entropy, this is a concept of entropy that is very important for both classical and quantum information theory. And now we have a connection between through black holes between quantum information and space-time geometry. And these developments that you mentioned of the alien formula and so on are all in this general area.
Yes, it's a beautiful formula. I'll place it on screen and put links in the description. Now, I haven't kept up with the literature, but my understanding is that it's in a Euclidean path integral, or lives in a Euclidean path integral, but I don't know if there's a Lorentzian derivation. And if not, is there some reason for the impediment? Why is it so tricky?
Well, the derivation involves path integral techniques, and the reason there is some Euclidean evolution is because it's usually necessary to prepare a state. So it's usually convenient to prepare a state by doing so-called Euclidean evolution. That's very common for the thermal state, where a thermal state can be viewed by evolving over a Euclidean time on a circle. But we don't think that this is fundamental to the derivation, and some researchers have suggested more natively, let's say, Lorentzian derivations of the formula. For example, Don Marrow, Shi Dong, and other collaborators from UC Santa Barbara have emphasized this more purely Lorentzian derivation of this formula. There is always a little bit of Euclidean evolution, because you need to get an answer for the entropy, which is a real answer for the entropy, and Euclidean path integrals give you phases,
Lorentzian path integrals, you mean?
Lorentzian path integrals give you phases, interference of waves and so on. So, but so recently there's been an understanding of this formula from a mostly Lorentzian point of view, which is quite useful and it's very useful and makes the derivation more general than what was done previously. Yeah, so this formula is being better and better understood, I should say, and applied to new situations.
And this island formula is one of the breakthroughs. There are a couple of breakthroughs of the past 15 years or so. One is the page curve, and this island formula has a relationship to the page curve, and that helps derive it. So can you please outline that?
Well, the formula is interesting because it connects black holes with quantum information. It gives us the amount of true fine-grained information that the black hole has. That's what makes it interesting. Now, a great breakthrough of the last few years was that the realization that you could apply this very same formula to for computing the entropy of Hawking radiation. And this involved also some conceptual breakthrough how to apply this formula. But fundamentally, it's the same formula. The page curve it's a curve that a person called Don Page proposed as how the information of Hawking radiation as it comes out of the black hole. You have the Hawking radiation coming out of the black hole. Then you can calculate the information that comes out as a function of time, or the entropy contained in that radiation as a function of time. And what you find is that if the black hole evolves in a unitary way according to the rules of quantum mechanics, then that information should grow and then decrease again, and decrease back to something small when the black hole evaporates completely. That's what's called the page curve. And it was always a challenge to calculate this page curve. And using this new formula, we can calculate the page curve, and it gives that type of qualitative behavior.
Now, speaking of constructing something, your dad helped fix elevators. And when you were 12, if my understanding is correct, that you built a working model with Rasty blocks.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, my dad was a very hands-on person, and he liked to, fix the car, fix the washing machine, everything. And then I always loved to watch it. It was a family activity, I guess.
Yes, now that led you to going into engineering, but was there anything there that you now still carry over with you into physics?
Well, I guess I view physics as a bunch of things that need to be fixed, and formulas that maybe we're not fixing wires or mechanical parts, but we're trying to build formulas and make all the formulas work together and fix a kind of conceptual architecture that tries to extend the conceptual architectures that we have right now. Right, that's what theoretical physics I think it's about. So expanding the conceptual tools that we have to describe nature.
Which of your results over the years do you think your dad would understand on site? Well, they're quite abstract, obviously, but if you were to explain it to him, which one do you think he would like the most?
Well, maybe something more concrete, like how energy flows after in particle collisions. So with Diego Hoffman, we did some calculations of that, and now thanks to the efforts of researchers like Ian Moult and others, they are being measured in great detail in colliders. So that's I think something that can be understood.
Now, my understanding is that Leonard Susskind's dad was a hands-on person as well. I believe a plumber. Mm-hmm. You and Lenny have a great relationship, and you sent an email to him many years ago. ER equals EPR, just a single word or equation, and he understood it. What did he understand?
Well, he understood it because we had been discussing that for quite a while. So the connection between entanglement and space-time geometry is part of the developments spurred by this new formula of black hole entropy derived by Ryu and Takayanagi that, as I said, suggested the connection between quantum information and the geometry of space-time. This is the type of information that we sometimes want to measure when we want to quantify entanglement. So this information measure is also useful for that purpose. So entanglement is a subtle form of correlation we can have in quantum systems, and of course entanglement was discovered originally by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, and is usually known by the acronym of EPR. So now in the same year, surprisingly in the same year, Einstein and Rosen wrote another paper, which was the first paper noticing that the original Schwarzschild solution doesn't describe one black hole, but essentially two black holes, that there are two regions, two outside regions. And they didn't understand everything, but they understood this part about the black hole. And it was later understood more completely. It was later understood completely by Kruskal, about 30 years later. But yeah, and that is sometimes called the Einstein-Rosen bridge. So the idea that there are two regions that look like flat space, and they are connected through a black hole horizon, and the two asymptotic regions share a single interior. And this, if you look at that region at the moment of time, then it looks like a bridge that joins two separate spatial geometries. So this also sometimes called a wormhole. And so ER stands for Einstein and Rosen.
So some people read that as saying that the wormhole is entanglement. Would you be so bold, or would you say that more like entanglement gives rise to some sort of geometric connection? How do you see it?
Well, so I think so. The idea is that so we were talking before about black holes, and we're saying that if we are looking at the black hole from the outside, we can view it as a quantum system. Now, when we look at the Schwarzschild solution, we really have two black holes. So what's the connection between the two black holes? The idea is that these two black holes are two separate quantum systems that are entangled with each other in a very particular entangled state. It's called the thermophile double, if you wanted to know the name of this particular entangled state. But if they're entangled in this particular entangled state, then the idea is that they give rise to a geometry, connected geometry, which is that of the full Schwarzschild solution or the Einstein-Rosen bridge. So in this particular example, I think the arguments that the entanglement creates this spacetime geometry or this spacetime connection is fairly clear and quite convincing, I would say. Now, then the question is whether this is true in any case that we have entanglement. That's a wilder claim, and I would say that we cannot make this claim in a meaningful way. In the sense that we don't know a description of geometry that is. If it is true, it should be true in some generalized sense of geometry. So it's definitely not true if our notion of geometry is the usual geometry that appears in Einstein's equations. Because if we have just a spin-and-a-half particle, that two spin-and-a-half particles which are entangled with each other, there is no connected geometry of any kind, of the conventional kind. But perhaps, so ER equal to PR is a bit like an aspiration. So it's like a slogan or a principle that perhaps a more complete theory of gravity should have. So there might be a new notion of geometry that would generalize Einstein's notion of geometry, and in which this property would be true even for a spin-and-a-half particle.
Earlier you said that you like to view physics problems as something that needs fixing. Mm-hmm. What are you fixing right now?
I'm trying to understand the wormholes. So wormholes are a bit like leaky pipes in the sense that the logic that surrounds them is not everything is fitting together. So we think we know a bunch of things about the theory of quantum gravity in the presence of wormholes. We like the effects of wormholes in some cases, that they produce very interesting effects. For example, they are important for justifying this island formula that you just mentioned. The derivation of that formula involves a certain kind of wormhole. On the other, they seem to give rise to the idea that the constants of nature are not quite fixed, but they maybe are are arbitrary and we should average over them. And in some of our models of string theory and so on, the constants of nature are really fixed, and so we don't know how to make everything compatible. I perhaps didn't explain clearly what the problem is. The problem is a bit subtle. Perhaps a short way to say it is that there are many ideas that surround wormholes, and they're not all compatible with each other. The question is, we probably need to modify some ideas, or maybe they have some subtleties that we haven't understood. And this is, not only what I'm working on, but many other people are also working on this area. It's one of the hot topics in our field at the time.
This video is sponsored by Shortform. If you want a free trial and an exclusive $50 off their annual plan, then go to the link in my description, shortform.com/TOE. If you're like me, you've encountered books that are so dense, finishing them is actually just the beginning. Shortform helps with that. Their book guides go far beyond pastiche summaries. They critique, they add context, they include interactive exercises, and connect ideas across authors. Take Gödel Escher Bach or The Master and His Emissary, two of the most demanding reads in consciousness studies on the popular market. My method is I read the guide first, then the book, then I read the guide again. So it's a triptych of engagement that cements understanding, better understanding for me. The GEB guide maps recursive structures in a way that exhibits intellectual pleiotropy, where one insight branches into consciousness, computation, and self-reference simultaneously. Shortform covers philosophy, science, and psychology, ipso facto, the intellectual core of this channel. They publish new guides weekly, and subscribers vote on what books get covered next. Their browser extension, Shortform AI, summarizes articles and YouTube videos with a single click. Go to shortform.com/TOE for a free trial and an exclusive $50 off your annual subscription. That's shortform.com/TOE. What about traversable wormholes?
Okay. So that's those are fun.
Do you also view those like toy models, or do you think that in our universe they may already be realized, or they may be realized in the future?
I don't think they exist in our universe. Well, I think it's highly unlikely that they exist in our universe. Maybe that would be a more polite way to say, or a more cautious way to say. But well, it's connected to what we discussed before, that if you entangle systems in certain black holes in a certain way, you could get a connection. And that connection gives you a wormhole, but it's not a traversable wormhole. So, and you cannot send signals, and you cannot travel through this wormhole. And that's consistent with the idea that it can be interpreted as entangled states, because using entangled states, you cannot send signals. However, if you bring these black holes closer together and you let them interact, and then you let them exchange a bit of information and so on, then they could develop this Einstein-Rosen bridge can change a little bit. The whole geometry of the black hole could change, and it could form a wormhole. So wormhole would be a traversable wormhole. It could form a traversable wormhole, and traversable wormhole is not quite a black hole, so they will not have a black hole horizon. And it would be some structure where you enter through one of the mouths of the wormhole and you exit through the other mouth of the wormhole. In the wormholes that are constructed this way, they don't allow you to travel faster than the speed of light in the space where the wormholes are sitting. So they are not like the science fiction wormholes that you might have heard in science fiction stories. And everyone gets excited about wormholes because you think, oh, they will allow us to travel, to the next galaxy and back in a short time. Those type of wormholes we don't think are compatible with the laws of physics. So that the ones that allow you to violate causality, or causality in the ambient space. So, but these are not. These are a bit more like long detours. But it's a long detour that you take using a wormhole. And let me make an analogy for this. For this kind of traversable wormholes that are the ones that we think exist.
Please.
Yeah. Well, before I make the analogy, I should say that they are classically forbidden. So classically, they cannot exist according to the classical equations, but they can exist thanks to quantum corrections, because in quantum physics, energies can be negative, and then they can exist. But now to the analogy. So in the there is this fun way to travel between 2 points on the surface of the Earth, which is to dig a tunnel and then go down and then go up to the other point. And then if you had a tunnel with no friction, then and you go with a little cart and with no friction, then you would slide down this tunnel and come back out in the other side. And in maybe half an hour, 40 minutes, you could be in any place on the surface of the world. Now, there are some small reasons why this would not work in practice or might be hard to realize in practice. The interior of the Earth is very hot. There are no frictionless things, and etc.
Just tiny reasons, yeah.
Yeah, there are a few technical inconveniences. Okay, but
yes.
In principle, it is possible. So these traversable wormholes are a bit like this, but imagine the surface of the Earth as a structure of space-time, and the traversable wormholes as this tunnel that you build through the Earth. And well, the Earth is nothing. There is nothing that exists there. So that's roughly something somewhat similar, and they will allow you to go between these 2 points, and they will allow you to go from your point of view very fast. So because there is a large gravitational field, you would not experience a very long time in going through these wormholes. So someone from the outside would see that it takes you, 10,000 years to go through the wormhole. But if you go and you travel yourself, maybe it will take you maybe 1 second. Again, these are not things that will exist in nature. They would require laws of physics, which are new particles that we haven't seen and stuff like this. So I'm not. These are some solutions that are compatible with the general principles of nature, but not the particular laws of nature that we have in our universe.
Speaking of wormholes, there was a hubbub about how there was a publicity campaign about quantum computers literally creating wormholes in the lab. Mm-hmm. Those were some of the pop-sci headlines. So what's the actual truth behind the headlines?
Yeah, so that is in this context of entangling quantum systems. So there is the idea that if you have a quantum system that is complex enough, it could create a space-time. It could create an emergent space-time, right? Now, this is an interesting point, and it's a subject that we've been investigating. And I guess with the promise of quantum computers is that they can make all kinds of new materials and new quantum states of matter. And this would be a very fun and interesting quantum state of matter that might allow us to test some of these ideas that we have about quantum gravity. Now, this also in particular tells you that if you create two pieces of matter in this way that have an emergent geometry, and that then they're entangled with each other, then they would create a wormhole that connects them. Now, what these authors did, they created a quantum simulation that had what they said was the simplest version of this wormhole. So they took the simplest model that displays some phenomenon similar to this wormhole, and they pared down the model to its very, very, very essentials, and they found some features that were a little bit like the features of this wormhole. So it's a correlated quantum system. They had a small number of qubits, maybe 7 qubits on each side. And so some people say, well, no, you don't have enough qubits. This is not the system that is complex enough. But I think I would say it's a first step in this direction. And I think as quantum computers will become more and more powerful, they will make better and better versions of this type of thing. And at some point, people will say, well, this really is looking like a wormhole, right? I mean, it's a bit like this question of when a sand pile becomes a sand pile, right? So, if you have 7 grains of sand, okay, maybe it's not a sand pile. But once you have enough grains, it will become more universally recognized as a sand pile.
So they simulated a wormhole but didn't actually create a wormhole, or what?
Well, it's debatable of whether in this type of setups you either simulate or create. So this is a bit of a language question. So if you have a condensed, if you create a quantum simulator, a quantum state of matter that has a certain property, let's say superfluid or whatever, are you creating it or simulating it? It's once the quantum computer allows you a level of control that you can do many things. You can create a quantum state that has various properties, and the question is whether you are simulating them or creating them. I think it's a bit philosophical.
And why are you working on these leaky pipe wormholes right now? What is it about them that excites you?
Well, it's that there is a conceptual problem. So there's a concept. There is a they are interesting because they give interesting effects, and they also raise questions. And we are trying to, and there is something not completely understood around them. And that's what is interesting. That by understanding them better, we'll understand quantum gravity in a deeper way. I think so. These wormholes were a mystery since, let's say, the 80s when people started thinking about this. I mean, soon after this Hawking information, that is related to the Hawking information problem, and researchers discussed them at the time. Coleman and Giddens and Strominger discussed them. And the situation was confusing at the time. It wasn't clear what the rules were for quantum gravity. And they didn't seem to be present in string theory in any way we understood. But now there are many effects that these wormholes have proven useful for deriving, for example, these formulas for deriving properties about the black hole or the energy spectrum of black holes. There is a series of beautiful works papers by Sad, Schenker, and Stanford, where they show that certain aspects of quantum chaos are reflected in a wormhole closely associated to the Schwarzschild solution. And yeah, so wormholes are doing wonderful things for us, and we should understand how to fit those wonderful things with the confusing aspects.
Speaking of Strominger, he treats the BMS group as a physical symmetry, and that's what undergirds celestial holography. I haven't heard you comment on celestial holography on that program. What do you make of it?
Yeah, so this program's been recently understanding subtle properties of gravity in flat space. So instead of trying to understand gravity at very short distances, they look at gravity at long distances. But they try to understand deeply the symmetries of flat space and what happens when you emit some waves of radiation at very long distances and so on. And they've uncovered lots of interesting symmetries. I mean, the BMS group is something that was recognized in the 60s, but they found an interesting connection between this BMS group and some other features of scattering amplitudes and other gravitational phenomena, such as the so-called gravitational memory effect and things like that involve scattering of gravity waves. Now, yeah, so this is a very interesting aspect. And so in the past, these symmetries were important for deriving, let's say, dualities between gravity systems and quantum field theories. So there was a beautiful paper of Brown and Henault who found that the three-dimensional anti-Sitter space, or particular three-dimensional negatively curved space, has a two-dimensional boundary. And on this boundary, it has a certain symmetry, which is the same type of symmetry you have in quantum critical systems in 1+1 dimensions. And then it was then used to propose the duality between these two systems. And well, Strominger himself used this to argue for this duality in general ways. So yeah, so this is it's something that has proven to be important in the past, and now We don't know whether flat space, gravitational physics in flat space has some alternative description in terms of some quantum system. Of course, if we had that alternative description, we could describe black holes and so on in flat space in a more complete way. And that's one reason for trying to find it. And is somehow also viewed as a stepping stone towards trying to understand the more realistic cosmology. So the cases where we understand the fully quantum mechanical description more precisely are cases with negative curvature, so cases like hyperbolic space. And then flat space is intermediate, and then let's say a sphere or an expanding universe are the more interesting ones.
Now, I know that you're also working on ds-CFT correspondences. Why is that so tricky?
Well, the ADS-CFT is this relationship between negatively curved spaces and field theories or quantum systems at the boundary. DS means de Sitter. So de Sitter was Dutch astronomer who proposed this expanding universe, and that is a good description of our universe at late times or also at very early times. And the structure of these two spacetimes is fairly similar, and they both have a kind of boundary. In the case of an expanding universe, that boundary is what happens very far into the future. So very far into the future, there is a kind of surface that looks spatially flat. It has the structure of three-dimensional space with no time. And it's natural to think that perhaps there is some statistical theory that describes such universes. So it would be a universe where it would be a description where the time would be emergent. And the main difficulty is that we don't have nice guesses. So we don't, in the case of the anti-de Sitter case, we had the help that in those cases we can have additional symmetries, such as a symmetry called supersymmetry, which is very technically useful and useful for generating examples of this relationship. But in the Sitter case, it's more complicated to generate examples. Now maybe we don't generate the examples because this relationship is not true. Maybe the relationship would be intrinsically approximate. So we don't know exactly why we haven't managed to find an example. It might be that we just don't have the right techniques to find it.
And supposing that DESI's results are correct and that there may be time-varying dark energy, does that put a monkey wrench in ds-CFT, or does that help ds-CFT? Or it would just be some small, mere technicality?
Well, I mean, of course, it would be a very interesting feature of the universe that the dark energy is changing. It's not logically connected with ds-CFT in any obvious way. So we could have varying dark energy or not varying dark energy. Of course, if we have a varying dark energy, the structure of the universe in the far future will not be de Sitter. It might still be de Sitter because the dark energy might eventually stop varying.
Right.
Now, something that is more worrisome is that some of the DESI fits have suggested that the value of the dark energy could be, of the equation of state could go below -1. That would be a more severe blow of our understanding of physics. So I suspect that probably will not be true. But
why though?
Well, because there are deep principles. The principles of no negative null energy. So these principles that enforce causality, that enforce traversability or lack of traversability of wormholes and so on. So I suspect that these principles are more important are very important, and I find them very sacred. Of course, if it was true that they're violated, it would be super interesting and it would be the biggest news in the last 100 years. But I very much doubt that that's what will happen. I suspect that once they fit the data in a different way, and so I don't think that there is enough evidence to claim that this equation of state parameter, which is called W, is less than -1.
Another pillar is unitarity. And I've heard many physicists say that they'd rather sacrifice locality
Right.
for unitarity, that unitarity is sacred. So, can you please give a taste as to why? Why is unitarity so important?
Unitarity is related to the conservation of probability. So, if it wasn't true, then we would have trouble with probabilities. So probabilities might be, not positive or bigger than 1, and we would have some bigger problems. So we wouldn't know how to interpret a theory where that's not true. So it might be that we might need to give up some other principle of quantum mechanics or some other aspect of the structure of quantum mechanics. That might be possible. Like these discussions of including the observer or some of the problems we face in quantum gravity with the emergence of time maybe will require us eventually to give up some of the structure of quantum mechanics. But I wouldn't necessarily say that we give up locality. I would say that we give up some manifest locality in some of our current descriptions. It's not completely obvious we are giving up locality. I think we just not manifest in the ways that we describe it.
What's a manifest locality versus an actual locality?
Well, the problem is that the locality is hard to define when you don't have a space-time, right? Or when you don't have a background space, a fixed space-time, right? So when we are thinking about quantum gravity, first of all, when we're thinking about quantum mechanics, let's say just for a single particle, the particle doesn't have a well-defined position and momentum everywhere. It can have various possibilities for its momentum and its velocity, right? Similarly, when we do quantum field theory, a field does not have to have a definite form in everywhere in space-time, but it could have probabilities of having various different possible forms. Now, when we talk about gravity, then what we are saying is that we have a metric or a space-time geometry, and it's not fixed. We can have various probabilities of having different space-time geometries. So 2 points that are on one surface may be far on that surface, but on some other surface they are smaller, and both have some probability, right? So that they're and so when you say that, you cannot say a priori where 2 points are far away or not. There is always the probability of having some surface where they are close by, and that's why locality is sometimes a little harder to define. But maybe it is local in the sense that maybe for each of the particular surfaces that appears, the theory is local in that sense, and there is some notion of causality that you cannot, if you have a space that is let's say asymptotically flat or which is flat far away, or this negatively curved space is far away. Then far away you have a causal structure that you define. By causal structure, what I mean is that 2 points might be reachable by an observer who travels at less than the speed of light, and that's usually that we think will be preserved by the bulk space-time, even though it's fluctuating and so on, even though there can be fluctuations where the points are closer and so on. In the end of the day, if you want to send a signal, you cannot send it faster than light. So causality continues to be preserved in that sense.
For the entanglement wedge reconstruction, there's an objection from Harlow. So please explain what's being presupposed. Explain this whole situation.
I think we can discuss this a little bit. So, Almeri, Dong, and Harlow wrote a very interesting paper where they propose some analogies between quantum error correction and the way that holography is supposed to work. So, basically, quantum error correction and the map between the bulk degrees of freedom and the boundary, or some analogies between the way that the bulk is embedded in the boundary theory and the way that the quantum information is embedded in a quantum error correcting code. And this was very nice, and then was a wonderful paper. And then there were a series of developments involving other techniques that people use to describe quantum systems that involve something called tensor networks. So tensor networks are roughly like neural networks, but to describe quantum systems. They're something analogous to neural networks, but is mathematical or a physical procedure, if you wish, to encode a series of qubits in a complex quantum system. Yeah, and this shed some light on how perhaps the black hole could be embedded into the boundary theory and other aspects of the holographic dictionary.
Now, in this ADS-CFT correspondence, or in holography generally, when there's a duality between the boundary and the bulk, is there reason to privilege one ontologically than the other? So, for instance, some will say that the bulk emerges from the boundary.
Yeah, that's a popular thing to say now because we think we understand better the boundary theory. But I think it might be that at some point we'll understand the bulk theory also well enough that we will view it as a true duality between the two things, and that both would be ontologically similar.
When I was speaking to Eric Verlinde, he said, no. He said the boundary is real. And then I said, why? Why? If they're dual. He said, well, they're not exactly dual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there is a sense in which the geometrical concepts of general relativity have some limitation, right? I mean, the general relativity itself is what we call an effective field theory. So it's some theory that is well defined at long distances, but at shorter distances has some problems. It's not quite well defined. So we already know it should be replaced by something else. However, we think that we can replace it by string theory, for example. And then if you take that point of view, then okay, the bulk theory in principle is also well defined, except that string theory is a work in progress. It's not a theory that has been completely understood. Many aspects have been understood, but some remain mysterious. And it is possible that in the future we'll understand this bulk theory well enough so that will be equivalent to the understanding we have of the boundary theory. But for now, that's a speculation.
Are many people working on M theory currently?
Well, M theory, I think, is viewed as a kind of phase or a region of some consistent theory, which also sometimes is called string theory, and it's a phase where it's 11-dimensional. So, and some people are working on some aspects of this, and I mean, I personally, with Aidan Herdershi, wrote a paper a couple of years ago, talking about a very interesting proposal from for M theory that is based on a certain matrix model. So the idea is that you can discuss scattering amplitudes in that theory using a simple quantum mechanical matrix model. Yeah, so people continue to work on this subject. It's part of the whole area of quantum gravity, and some questions might be interesting to ask in that 11-dimensional context. Some might be interested in a different context. So.
Your office at the IAS is infamously fairly empty on the walls. Why?
Well, maybe I never bothered too much to put something on the walls. And it does have a few. It has a few pictures of, but not too much. Yeah.
Is that a reflection of your mind? You like to keep it clean, or who cares?
Yeah. I like to keep it clean, keep people focused on the blackboard, and keep us also focused on the blackboard when we come and discuss to my office.
What is it like to live in your mind?
I don't know anything else.
What does your wife say?
Well, I guess she finds sometimes a little strange our obsessions with certain things, and that's
Same with my wife.
Maybe I'm a little obsessive, I guess she says.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
Are you able to turn off your mind, or do you just keep churning on problems?
No, I'm not able to turn it off too easily. Yeah, that's right. That's one of the things she complains about.
Yeah, same. Yeah, and I constantly have ideas. I constantly have to pause what we're doing, and then I have to jot it down and interrupt. I don't know. Are you the same?
Yeah. No, I disconnect, but it takes me a while. So, so yeah.
What's your average day like? Do you have a routine where you set work from, say, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. or what have you, and you say, I'm not going to work outside of that? Or...
Yeah, I have something like that. So, yeah, usually I'm in my office from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. And yeah, I like to do exercise in the morning and go to the office. And in the office we discuss with various people, with other researchers, with postdocs, visitors, and that's a big part of the day. So, I mean, that's a big part, I think, of scientist life is to talk to other people and interchange ideas and make progress together. Yeah.
What exercises?
I usually just go jogging.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm super curious about your work schedule. So, do you fix that you're going to be alone, closed door from 12 to 3 p.m., and you can take meetings before that, or is it just varied?
No, I usually allowed myself to be interrupted. So I like to be available, and usually I arrange meetings with students or postdocs. It is sort of a bit more chaotic. So, and usually there are fixed times for seminars and things of that kind.
What's the difference between a good PhD student and a great PhD student?
Well, I guess a great PhD student has new ideas and comes up with great problems and comes up with things that blow your mind away. So that things that are unexpected, things that you think are wrong when you first hear them, and then eventually you realize that, oh no, that's right, that's a great idea. Yeah. Many times I've told my students that what they said were wrong, and they ended up being great ideas.
Why don't you give us a flavor of that?
Well, for example, a person called Aitor Leikowicz came with an interesting generalization of this formula of Ryu-Takayanagi that we were talking about, and I said, well, I thought it was probably wrong and not justified, but in the end it was correct, and yeah, unfortunately he didn't publish it. The other people published it. So that was one of my failures as an advisor.
Many people may not know this, but your breakthrough paper from 97, it was assigned essentially or inspired by a boring project that was given to you by Callan, your advisor. Well, why don't you tell that story? And then I want to know if you're working on a boring project right now that you think may lead to something.
Well, I think, of course, Curt Callan is one of the greatest founding fathers of the standard model of particle physics and all that. And he had a great intuition for great problems. And one of the problems he gave me was to work on some statistical models or field theories in hyperbolic space. And yeah, so that I thought that was a boring boring problem, but I did it because he was my advisor. He told me, but it gave me some tools that then were useful later.
Have you assigned a boring problem to one of your PhD students that turned out to be, well, no one can match your brilliance and breakthroughs, but you understand?
Well, I don't know whether my problems were as good as Curt Callan's problems. Maybe. Well, I guess I think they are somewhat interesting, but yeah, maybe my students thought they were boring.
You said that you are a perpetual student. So who are you learning from right now?
Well, I guess I learn from other people. I learn from my students. I learn from our postdocs. learn from other researchers. I mean, we're constantly learning new things. So
Okay, let's be concrete. What's something in recent memory that they taught you?
well, for example, we were talking about this new formulas for black hole entropy that Witten and Pennington derived. I mean, I had no idea of those techniques, those mathematical techniques. I had to learn them. They taught me these techniques to me. So a new way to think about it.
Now Seiberg, another colleague of yours, mentioned that you go after problems that most people stay away from. So is that just his characterization of you? It's a mischaracterization, or would you say that's correct? Like, what is it about
No,
you that?
I don't think. Well, I think many people work on the same problems that I work on. I feel. I mean, people are interested in black holes. People are interested in quantum mechanics and black holes, and I feel I've always been in a community of people who have been interested in similar things.
What's a result then that you hope is true, but let's say you have. See, ADS CFT has plenty of evidence and there's no proof. So I was about to say, what's something you hope is true, but you have no proof of? But proof is quite strong.
Right.
So I'll be even weaker and say, what's something you hope is true that you have even little evidence of?
Okay, I'm going to mention something that I hope is true. Some people think it's not true. And so is that when you have the theory of inflation, the field range has finite, and the field can, in other words, that the field cannot move much during the inflationary time. Now, the reason for thinking that this might be true is, well, various things about wormholes. So it's not very clear, and some people, most notably Eva Silverstein, think that this is not true, and we've always debated this. But if it were true, it would be interesting because it would be a falsifiable prediction. So from ideas of quantum gravity. Unfortunately, we cannot argue whether it's true or not. If it were true, it would predict that the experiments in the near future would not see gravity waves. The experiments that look for gravity waves in the CMB would not see gravity waves. One part of me hopes that this is true so that we could have a prediction. The other part of me hopes that we will see gravity waves from inflation. I think that would be more exciting because it would tell us, quantum gravity is real and inflation probably happened, and that would be real. That's one of the most I think exciting prospects to see this gravity waves. That was a long and somewhat technical answer to your question. You were probably hoping for a more flashy answer.
Well, just so you know, this podcast, it skews quite technical. Now, obviously, it can't just be with this many subscribers and watchers just technical, but there are many artists and truck drivers and so forth. But we skew it toward academics and researchers in physics, philosophy, math. So, speaking of flashy, you have a paper from 2 years ago or so. See, on YouTube, you can be flashy with your titles, with your thumbnails, and so forth, but there's not many paper titles that are grabbing. And so when I find one, I always find it fun. You have one called, oh gosh, let me recall this correctly. Real observers solve imaginary problems.
Yeah. So, well, this was a bit of a play on words. So there are some calculations that you can do in the Sitter space, which is this cosmology. There is a Euclidean version of the Sitter space, and as we mentioned before, sometimes the Euclidean versions of certain spacetimes can be useful for calculating thermal properties of those spaces. And in this case, it would the Euclidean version of the Sitter space is a sphere, and it is supposed to calculate the space as seen from an observer who's in the center of that space and the thermodynamic observations of that observer. This is something that was discussed originally by Gibbons and Hawking in the 70s. It's really closely connected to their work on black hole thermodynamics. Now, when you compute, so that's a leading classical effect, and then if you compute the quantum corrections, you find the funny feature that the quantity that is supposed to be the number of states, or counting the total number of states of this thermodynamic system, is not positive. So it can have an I. So the I, the imaginary unit, to some power that depends on the dimension. So in different dimensions, you get different answers. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes there is an I, sometimes it's negative, and so on. And so the idea is that that if you consider a slightly more complicated discussion where you include an observer that is moving in this space, so you don't just do the empty space, but you do the space with the observer, as you mentioned this paper of Chandrasekharan, Longo, Pennington, and Witten. They found from the Lorentzian point of view, so from the real-time point of view, that it was useful to put an observer, but also from this Euclidean point of view, if you put an observer, then now the number becomes positive. So in that sense, putting an observer, a real observer that is there in the system, solves this problem with the imaginary numbers that were appearing. So that's what that title is about.
And as I was going through it, does it mean that there is no view from nowhere in quantum gravity, that you require an observer?
Yeah. That's what happens here.
Even in perturbation theory around a fixed background?
Well, in perturbation theory, it depends on the background. So it has a bit to do with the choice of time. So when you in general relativity, there is no a priori notion of what time is, so you can redefine your times and so on. But if there is something going on in your space-time, like for example, in inflation or in cosmology, where the universe is expanding, then in our universe we can think of time as the mean density of the universe. So as the universe dilutes, then time progresses, right? And we can use that to measure the passage of time. Or we can have a clock that, if we have an actual clock, then the clock also measures the passage of time, but it's a physical system that has some parts and is moving and so on, and that measures. So of course, somehow the physics definition of what time is, the more practical definition is what a clock measures. The question is, can you measure time without the clock? And the idea is that you can't. So
interesting.
You would need a clock of some kind to be able to talk about time, and that's what these observers are doing. And they're providing some type of clock, and also some location in the universe to say where you are. So we are where the Earth is, and that's our location.
So you say we can't measure time without a clock, or you can't measure duration without a clock, or are those two the same to you?
I would say the same view. Yeah.
So then would you also say that we can't measure length without a ruler?
Yeah.
Or is that somehow different in this?
No, it's the same. Yeah. When people talk about general relativity, even in Einstein thinking of general relativity, when he was imagining a system of rulers, of observers that were moving in space, and they were exchanging information, synchronizing their clocks, and comparing the rulers and so on. And in the classical theory, you can consider those observers as having no mass and no energy and not doing anything. But once you consider the quantum theory, you cannot do that, and you have to take them into account as physical systems. And so, it's part of what makes the quantum theory a little more complicated.
What's the justification for having a single minus sign? So in other words, a single time direction. Why not have two time directions, or three, or what have you?
I don't have a good answer. So with a single minus, we understand what the theory is like, and we are used to that. And I don't know if it is possible to have more minus signs. It gets very confusing and so on, but just that it is confusing doesn't mean it's impossible. But so I don't know if you can. It's not what we seem to have in nature, but yeah.
I know there are two times theories, like bars, I believe.
Well, it's true that sometimes you can introduce more than one time. And this is an idea that goes back to Dirac in his treatment of scale invariant theories like electromagnetism and so on. But usually, if you do that, then you also have the second time, together with some spatial coordinates, form what's sometimes called projective coordinates, which where you eventually end up removing again the time that you introduced. So you somehow introduce one extra time, and then you end up removing it again. But it's useful to introduce it to make manifest some of the symmetries of the theory. And it's true. I mean, that I don't view this as a fundamentally new introduction of time. I mean, that is something we understand, and I've used it myself in some of the papers. But I guess the question is whether really we have more than one physical time. That I don't know.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying today's episode. If you're hungry for deeper dives into physics, AI, consciousness, philosophy, along with my personal reflections, you'll find it all on my Substack. Subscribers get first access to new episodes, new posts as well, behind-the-scenes insights, and the chance to be a part of a thriving community of like-minded pilgrimers. By joining, you'll directly be supporting my work and helping keep these conversations at the cutting edge. So click the link on screen here, hit subscribe, and let's keep pushing the boundaries of knowledge together. Thank you and enjoy the show. Just so you know, if you're listening, it's CurtJaimungal.org, CurtJaimungal.org. Spacetime is doomed.
Well, I think that tries to echo the Minkowski's dictum that space is doomed. I mean, we won't have space again. We won't have time. We have now space-time. And now you say, well, space-time is doomed. What that means is that the new theory of quantum space-time will have to use a different concept. That there will be a new concept, and we don't really know what the new concept is. So that's what this quotation tries to emphasize.
And what do you make of it?
It's a challenge for us to find a new concept. There should be a new fundamental concept, and I would say that we don't know what the new fundamental concept of quantum gravity is. So the basic concept, in the same way that space-time is the basic concept for general relativity, we don't know what the fundamental concept for quantum gravity is.
Two approaches come to mind. So one is Verlinde's entropic gravity.
Yeah.
And then another is Nima's positive geometries.
Yeah.
So have you looked deeply into them enough to talk about what interests you about them and potentially what disinterests you about them?
Well, I think this idea of entropic gravity seems to be very useful and relevant when we think about what happens near a black hole horizon. And it's related to this interesting connections between gravitational and thermodynamics in the context of near black hole horizons. It's not clear how this extends beyond black hole horizons. And also, more recently, as we were saying, there is a deeper connection between quantum information and gravity. So it's not just thermodynamics or just entropy; it's just this more fine-grained concept. That's probably what Eric Berlinde thinks has in mind. But yeah, so maybe some version of that might be true. I mean, all these are ideas for some ways to get at the correct structure. And Nima's discussion is connected a bit to the, well, it's the idea that you study scattering amplitudes, and from far away, and try to reconstruct the space-time where that scattering is occurring, and determine the scattering amplitude through some other alternative theory or other alternative principles, and then the usual space-time will come out out of something else. But we haven't yet found it. So it's certainly something people are. I mean, it's a challenge, as we said, and people are trying to meet this challenge in different ways. And those are interesting ideas, and in particular, this idea of looking at the deep mathematical structures in scattering amplitudes is very promising because you might or might not find space-time, but you'll definitely understand, and people have definitely understood the scattering amplitudes in ways that are very useful and powerful for colliders. So, I mean, these methods that they've developed are now used in particle accelerators, and are useful for computing other things like cosmological observations and many other applications.
What is it about NEMA that you admire? Like, what's different about it?
Well, he has unbounded energy. He has an amount of energy that is pretty amazing, and he can go from some mathematical discussions about the structure of Grassmannians or whatever they are, and to aspects of phenomenology in particle physics, and he is able to follow many different subjects. He's very amazing.
Actually, my brother, who is at the University of Toronto, is a professor in math finance, was also at the University of Toronto as an undergrad with NEMA, and said that I've always remembered NEMA's energy.
Yeah.
So what about Witten? What is it about Witten that you admire? What is it like to collaborate with Witten?
Well, it's wonderful. I mean, he's very fast, and very deep, as I was saying. Yeah, it's really great. He has a depth of understanding that is, light years ahead from definitely from mine. Yeah. Again, he has both a knowledge of math and physics that is amazingly broad and amazingly deep. I mean, many people, you can be deep but not very broad, but you can be very broad and not very deep. But he's both things in an amazing way. He knows things better than the specialists in those fields. So. and this in many, many different fields.
So Strominger had a paper recently, February of this year, I believe, where he used GPT, one of the models of GPT, to find gluon amplitudes. Now, do you use AI? Do you hope to use AI?
Yeah, I hope to use AI. I use it in a simple way. I haven't written a paper with it. I use it to help me, with some calculations, formulas, as probably you and many of our listeners are using AI. I think they found a really interesting way to use it, and they found an interesting formula, and I'm actually discussing this formula with one of our with a collaborator of Andy's, who's a postdoc at our institute, Alfredo Guevara. So we are, we're analyzing some other. We're doing some follow-up work on this paper,
Yes.
And studying some of the consequences of this formula.
When I was speaking to Edward Frankel, he said that, who also collaborated with Witten, he said Witten speaks in fully formed sentences that are like an essay where each word matters.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, he understands it completely, and then you sometimes say, "Oh no, but it's better to think about it this other way," and then you realize, no, really, the way that Edward said it in the beginning, that was the best way to say. Yeah. So. Yeah.
So going back to AI, so for LLMs, like, what do you personally use them for? Do you use them for idea generation, or do you use them to learn about some topic, or just something mundane, like, hey, make this recipe for me for different amounts of people?
Well, maybe learning about topics I don't know that are well known, so that as a better Google search. I do some formulas with it. I ask it to check some formulas, and I mean, for doing integrals, it can be better than Mathematica sometimes. But then you check it with Mathematica. So Mathematica is this computer program of symbolic manipulation that we use it. So it's good for discovering new formulas, I think, proposing new formulas. It's not always right, and it's can make mistake as the warning sign tells you it's true. So,
yes.
But it's useful. It's very useful. I have no doubt that it will be more useful in the future.
Yes, yeah. The progress in the past few years is remarkable.
Yes.
So, as you know, the podcast is watched by many researchers, many PhD students, many blah, blah, blah. So many of them will like to know, how the heck do those in the top of their fields use AI? So you just mentioned that you use it to teach yourself and potentially to generate new formulas and so forth. Can you be more specific? Because there's some ways of using it that are poor, and there's some ways, I'm sure, that are better than others.
I would advise people not to imitate what I do in AI. I think maybe I feel already like a dinosaur that I'm not learning it fast enough. And you should try it, and you should explore yourselves and find new ways yourselves to do it. I don't have a good answer myself. I haven't found myself a really good way to use it. I'm sure that there are wonderful ways to use it. It's a powerful technology, and I really encourage you to experiment. I tell this to my students. They come and say, "Well, I tried this calculation. Did you try it with AI?" Yeah.
Sir, what's a piece of advice that you've received? Could be from your advisor, could be from anyone that you keep coming back to, or that you pass on to your students.
Well, it sounds trite, but just be open-minded and try to learn, question things, understand things deeply. Don't go too fast. Just don't repeat what everyone says. Just understand things your own way. I think those are very important things to do.
Can you tell me about some way of understanding that was someone else's way, didn't work for you, and then you reformulated it to your own way?
Yes. It's hard to give an example, but it often happens that people sometimes sometimes there is something called lore, right? That people in the field maybe repeat, but they haven't really thought about through very much, and then if you work with something and do the calculations from the beginning, go to basics, and you really understand it. And it's just that people were repeating things without having done the calculation, without really having understanding it, without having understood it. Now, examples. Well, I remember when I started working on cosmological perturbation theory, I found lots of confusing things, and I was very confused about how these calculations were done in a curved space, in an expanding universe, and so on. I had to go back to basics, how to do it with the harmonic oscillator, a time-dependent harmonic oscillator, and so on. And that was useful to me. And I feel sometimes in some pieces in the literature, people were, inventing some grand general schemes that were not respecting were not working for the simplest case. So for the harmonic oscillator. And that was useful for me to go through this, just to understand and develop things yourself. And then once you understand things by yourself, you understand what other people are saying, right? You say, "Oh, this is what this paper was saying," and you can then read the other papers and understand what they are saying.
There's a lecture that you gave at Harvard called the Chilloquium, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, you said that you didn't feel good enough as a graduate student.
Mm-hmm.
And many graduate students feel like that.
Mm-hmm.
So what changed for you?
Well, I think it's common, maybe not to feel good, that to feel that maybe you're not good enough. There are the people from the past that did some great things, but this is not your time. Now things are more difficult, and many people go perhaps to graduate school thinking that they will go in and do all kinds of amazing discoveries from day one, and the reality is that you need to learn many things. You need to know what's known. You need to, and it takes some time, but eventually you'll make your contributions. First there will be, small contributions, then maybe slightly bigger contributions. You'll become a specialist in your field, and then maybe you'll have a great idea at some point. You'll make an important contribution, and I think if you are in your career in science, you'll make some of these contributions along the way. And sometimes you'll make them in the beginning of the career, sometimes you'll wait longer, but eventually you'll make big contributions, and sometimes maybe you make contributions which you didn't realize they were big, and then they become bigger later. And
yes,
yeah, and yeah, maybe some things that were thought to be big, then they are not big. So we'll see. But it's all part of contributing to science, and I think that's what's important. Of course, there is the issue of careers and finding a job and so on, and that's always challenging.
Did you once tell Lisa Randall that you'd like to write a science fiction paper?
It is possible. Oh yes, I did. Yeah. So I wrote a kind of science fiction paper on these traversable wormholes. So the stuff we were talking about before is related to traversable wormholes, was using one of her ideas. So something called the Randall-Sundrum model.
Yes, yeah. And to be clear to people who didn't read it, it's not science fiction in the sense that it has a hero and then an antagonist, an evil villain.
No, there's no villains. It's just the discussion of these traversable wormholes, assuming this. Okay, so the Randall-Sundrum model is a possibility for physics beyond the standard model, and there are various versions of it. And there's one particular version which allows for the construction of traversable wormhole solutions. Part of the work that Randall and Sundrum did was that to notice that those particular models for physics beyond the standard model were compatible with all current measurements. Of course, they make some new predictions for the future, but they're at least compatible with all the current things we know. So they're not ruled out. And so one of those versions which are not ruled out could allow for traversable wormholes. Of course, that they are not ruled out doesn't mean that they are likely to exist. And also it doesn't mean that constructing these wormholes, we constructed mathematically the wormholes as solutions. We didn't give a physical procedure for making them. So it's a mathematical curiosity, if you wish. But it kind of shows that it gives an interesting scenario where traversable wormholes could exist and could be relatively big.
Professor, I just wanted to thank you for spending so much time with me, and I appreciate it.
Sure, it's been a pleasure, and good luck. Good luck to everyone.
Hi there, Curt here. If you'd like more content from Theories of Everything and the very best listening experience, then be sure to check out my Substack at Jaimungal.org. Some of the top perks are that every week you get brand new episodes ahead of time. You also get bonus written content exclusively for our members. That's CurtJaimungal.org. You can also just search my name and the word Substack on Google. Since I started that Substack, it somehow already became number 2 in the science category. Now, Substack, for those who are unfamiliar, is like a newsletter, one that's beautifully formatted. There's zero spam. This is the best place to follow the content of this channel that isn't anywhere else. It's not on YouTube. It's not on Patreon. It's exclusive to the Substack. It's free. There are ways for you to support me on Substack if you want, and you'll get special bonuses if you do. Several people ask me, like, hey, Curt, you've spoken to so many people in the fields of theoretical physics, of philosophy, of consciousness. What are your thoughts, man? Well, while I remain impartial in interviews, this Substack is a way to peer into my present deliberations on these topics. And it's the perfect way to support me directly. CurtJaimungal.org, or search Curt Jaimungal Substack on Google. Oh, and I've received several messages, emails, and comments from professors and researchers saying that they recommend Theories of Everything to their students. That's fantastic. If you're a professor or a lecturer or what have you, and there's a particular standout episode that students can benefit from, or your friends, please do share. And of course, a huge thank you to our advertising sponsor, The Economist. Visit economist.com/toe, TOE, to get a massive discount on their annual subscription. I subscribe to The Economist, and you'll love it as well. Toe is actually the only podcast that they currently partner with, so it's a huge honor for me, and for you, you're getting an exclusive discount. That's economist.com/toe, TOE. And finally, you should know this podcast is on iTunes, it's on Spotify, it's on all the audio platforms. All you have to do is type in Theories of Everything and you'll find it. I know my last name is complicated, so maybe you don't want to type in Jaimungal, but you can type in Theories of Everything and you'll find it. Personally, I gain from rewatching lectures and podcasts. I also read in the comment that Toe listeners also gain from replaying. So how about instead you re-listen on one of those platforms like iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, whatever podcast catcher you use. I'm there with you. Thank you for listening.